I think that Trump's choice, if we just looked at the cost-benefit analysis, is very obvious, and that choice favors Russia. Ukraine has an estimated 12 to 14 trillion dollars of natural resource wealth. Russia has an estimated 75 to 90 trillion dollars in natural resource wealth. So the Russian deal, A, much bigger upside. B, the Russians are providing security for free. You don't need to risk US troops. You don't need to risk US military. You don't have to take the risk of World War III against Russia. The second problem is the downside risk. So if, let's say, Trump agreed with Keir Starmer that, like, okay, we're going to back you and you're going to give us, that is, Ukraine, Zelensky is going to sign over some mineral earths to us. For that, the United States have to give a security guarantee to Ukraine, which means that potential, A, that will be very, and then as Boris Johnson said, financial support. So you have to provide financial support to Ukraine and take the risk of war against Russia, because providing security guarantee means that you're going to go to war if Russia violates the territory that you're guaranteeing. So there's very little downside in doing a deal with Russia, and there's a much greater upside. Doing the deal with Ukraine under the leadership of the City of London has huge downside and very dubious upside. That's that. And then if the United States gets along with Russia, then it's not just the wealth that's there available in Ukraine, it's the whole 75 trillion worth of Russian resources that are available for joint ventures, mutual cooperation and development. And so I think it's pretty much a no-brainer, unless you're completely obsessed with controlling that and dismembering Russia and regime changing Putin. And the downside is potential nuclear showdown with Russia. And the upside is rare earth minerals that are the deal that is going to be implemented through some fund that's going to be created. And then the United States first has to provide the seed capital for this fund, and then they will get a portion of future proceeds. But they're not going to have necessarily full control over it. And then who knows what might be in it, because some experts that I read say that there are no rare earth minerals in any feasibly exploitable quantities in whatever is under Ukraine's control, and that whatever is there is already under Russian control. I think that the disadvantage that we have in the West, and that includes the United States, is that we have been at the receiving end of practically daily 24/7 campaign of demonization of Russia. Boris Yeltsin had approval rating of, depending on who you ask, between 2 and 6% in the 1990s. And his government was much more repressive than the government of Vladimir Putin is. But the fact that his government was repressive, the fact that he had a very strict control over the media space, much more so than Vladimir Putin, that didn't bother us in the slightest. We only liked him because he allowed Western financial institutions and Western corporations to do in Russia exactly whatever they wanted. So that's why we loved him. I think we have to overcome this fear of Russia, because it's largely been contrived by propaganda and by distortions which absolutely do not correspond with the reality. And if you look at the let's say the polls which ask the Russians, are you happy? Are you unhappy? Do you feel free to pursue your life the way you want? Do you approve of your government's leadership? Do you think that the government is moving in the country is developing in the right direction? You will see that Russians overwhelmingly answer positively. And the understanding of what Russia is very distorted. We all think of it as some dark, rusty place where people have a miserable existence under some harsh, repressive dictatorship. But that's not the case at all. I think that people should consider visiting Russia, traveling there. If they can't, they should follow the account of Westerners who live in Russia and they will realize that Russia is a normal place. It's not a upper volta with missiles. It's an advanced, modern, technological society. It's an increasingly prosperous society. And many people in the West will then say, oh yeah, like in a dictatorship, if you criticize, then they come for you and they put you in prison. So people are afraid to say what they really mean. No, that's nonsense. I don't think there's any such understanding among the European leaders, which is why it's only a matter of time until they all get swept out of power. If we go back to what we know, what George Soros and other Western officials told us, that this is a conflict between two systems of governance. And it seems to me, from everything that we've seen so far, that Donald Trump and his government have decided to oppose this system. And so if you oppose this system, then you're opposing the current governments in London, Paris, Berlin, Stockholm, and many others. Some are covertly opposed to it, I suspect. If I were sitting in London in the ruling establishment, I wouldn't quite trust Giorgia Meloni. And then there are others who I would be wondering about. And I think that your choice is not to what extent you will, if you're serious about this, it's not a choice of saying to what extent you might opportunistically support all this because there might be some kind of a profit for you at the end of the road. I think that the real choice, the serious choice, is whether you're going to go along with it or whether you're going to oppose it. And one system of governance is the Western oligarchic system that gives rise almost predictably to colonialism, to imperialism. But I think it's the question of opposing or supporting this system. This system has really given us a lot of these really bad things that we've experienced over the years: creeping totalitarianism, repression, censorship, lies and distortion as the main currency of persuasion, large-scale demoralization of our societies, a collapse of living standards, loss of prosperity. I think even covert opium wars. We see more and more people in the West being addicted to drugs and alcohol, and then the forever wars. And so now the reason why I suspect that the Trump administration is perfectly aware of all this is because in that interview that Secretary of State Rubio gave after speaking with Zelensky, and after Zelensky rejected the deal, he used the word hustle. He actually said something, I hope that they're not hustling us. But then they know that they are. And they also understand that it's not Zelensky. Zelensky wouldn't dare in a million years do this unless somebody put him up to it. And that somebody is the British ruling establishment. So again, London dispatches Boris Johnson to Kiev, and Johnson arrives there for the occasion of the third anniversary of the special military operation, and that was on 24th February. Two things happened almost immediately. One, Zelensky reversed himself. He said, oh, okay, I'll accept the American deal now. And the second thing that happened is that the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, voted to extend Zelensky's presidential mandate. That was the second time they voted because the first time they voted wrong. But now Boris Johnson comes there and they vote again. And then they said, okay, Zelensky is still president. It doesn't change anything because his term expired. The parliament's vote is a fig leaf because Ukraine has a constitution, and it's very clear that presidential elections can be delayed, and the term is 5 years and not a day longer. Ultimately, what happens is that if the government in Ukraine changes and the next government is aligned with Moscow and or with the new administration in the United States, they will tear up the 100-year partnership agreement between Ukraine and Britain. Keir Starmer is just a figurehead. Boris Johnson, again, is very deeply involved. Two big problems emerged. One is the problem of Zelensky rejecting the American deal. And two is the problem of Zelensky's legitimacy because his presidential mandate expired in May of last year.
May.
So this now explains why Volodymyr Zelensky can't sign the deal with the Americans, because he already signed over the lion's share of Ukraine's wealth to the Brits. And then I learned that there was, on the 4 days before Donald Trump was inaugurated, on the 16th January, Sir Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Great Britain, traveled to Kiev, where he and Volodymyr Zelensky signed a 100-year partnership between the Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Ukraine, which apparently contains a secret appendix. And in that secret appendix, it says that upon cessation of hostility, Great Britain will, Ukraine turns over their natural resource wealth, as well as infrastructure, things like ports, natural gas deposits, storage facilities, pipelines, power plants, titanium deposits, and on, to British interests. I think that the way people are reacting in social media suggests that actually Donald Trump has very strong support. And then we have the question of Europe, which seems to have united behind warmongers and seems determined to go to war against Russia. But I think that's very hollow, in fact, because it's limited to the ruling establishments who don't actually enjoy support from the people. I think that for London and for Western Europe, the game is lost. And they're making a whole lot of noise and doing a lot of trash talk to try to impress everybody that they're serious, that they matter, that they have power, that they can change things. But I think ultimately that they can't. And then as a result, they have to increasingly engage in censorship. They have to cancel elections. They have to sabotage elections in different ways, as Macron has done in France. They have to rig them, as I think they might have done in Germany. If you don't have the support of the people, if the people believe that you're deceiving them and lying, then your whole agenda isn't going to get very far. Now, I see that a lot of analysts, a lot of observers are now coming up and saying, oh, Donald Trump is mounting a dictatorship. Oh, his public support is really not what it's made out to be. Actually, people are against him. It doesn't ring true to me. People cite polls. Polls are rigged by habit. They're routinely rigged. They don't mean anything. And then there's a question of money. Ursula von der Leyen wants to spend 800 billion euros on a Rearm Europe program. Where's she going to get that? Where's she going to get 800 billion euros? I think that the only place they can get it from is the printing press, which means that they're going to destroy the euro. And then if your euro is worthless, then your whole house of cards comes down. And so whether this is just posturing or whether these are real intentions, I think we'll find out with time. But just introducing tariffs like this without preparing the grounds could be very counterproductive. And I think it could actually be Donald Trump's Achilles heel, because if the economy goes south, if the US economy goes south, then he opens himself to attacks from his political opponents that are actually going to be gathering some public support, and then he's in trouble. And Donald Trump makes some of these statements, or other people in his administration, as pretexts to introduce tariffs against this or that country. But I'm not sure whether this is a real thing or if it's a negotiating ploy, because if you introduce tariffs against a country, you have to prepare the ground for it, because in and of themselves, tariffs can exacerbate inflation, which is already potentially a huge problem for Trump administration. There are measures that the Trump administration can take beyond just introducing tariffs, or he can take them in concert with the tariffs that could maybe create a buffer, create some financial cushioning. But I think that's going to take a lot of coordination. I think that all the talk about bringing Canada into the United States, bringing Greenland into the United States, I think they're dead serious about this. But if we take a step back, the key problem, the problem ultimately, is the overhang of unpayable debts in the United States economy. And you don't have too many ways around it. One of them is default, to say, we can't pay these debts, so we're not going to pay them, too bad, which would be very bad. Then a different way of default is through inflation, that you simply dilute those debts away. That you can manipulate to, let's say, soften the blow from inflation and all this debt, or to reduce the impact. And what exactly the administration is going to do about all this is not clear to me. And I think it's not clear because they can't say it obviously, because they are going to get attacked by their opponents. So I think that some of it is going to be by stealth. And then the real moves, the big moves that they're going to make, I think that they're going to be ambushing us all collectively. But you can also go the route of increasing the economies, increasing the wealth and productivity in the economy. And bringing in Canada and Greenland could be part of that strategy. If you avail yourself of if the economy of Canada suddenly came under the American economy, that would be effectively bringing in wealth from there into your economy and, let's say, refloating it. Same with Greenland. There's going to be resources there that the American companies can exploit, that the American banks can fund, and that effectively constitutes new collateral that can back another major credit cycle and improve, let's say, reduce the drag from the debt overhang. But that's a whole lot of moving parts. I think that talking about bringing car production in the United States has the obvious benefit of creating jobs for the American people, and then you have their political support. Is this going to make a huge difference long term? I'm not sure, and I think it could blow back in some ways as well. I think that in part it's to do with boosting your negotiating position versus your neighbors. And then also Canada is part of the British Commonwealth. And it seems to me that Canada has been quite active in flooding the United States with fentanyl. It's not just Mexico. And I think that the Americans are aware of that. And so I think that putting pressure on Canada serves damaging their economy so that one day they might feel inclined to join the United States, and B, weakening the hand of London. I suspect that in part, with respect to Canada, for example, I think that they are actively engineering, for the lack of a better term, annexation of Canada. And the CIA playbook in changing governments usually includes destroying their own economies first. Because when the economy, as Nixon said, when they wanted to regime change Salvador Allende in Chile, he said, make the economy scream. Because when the economy goes south, then people are very unhappy, and then they want a change in government, and then you offer them a solution and you support people who will say, hey, this is not working out, we should be joining the United States. So that could be a part of it. So I think it's very difficult to judge all these moves without considering what the whole context might be. And I think that Trump is at risk of sabotage, of new public attacks, and possibly some way of removing him or even assassinating him. The British government, the British Empire, has a long history of assassinating leaders who oppose it, going back to at least Abraham Lincoln. Russiagate, I'm not sure if that's going to fly. We've seen over the last few days 17 Democratic congressmen and women deliver a very strong message against Trump, but they got caught speaking the same message word for word. And then all this erupted on X, where they showed them delivering the same message word for word. People are not stupid. They can see if all these supposed leaders elected by the people are speaking the same message word for word, then somebody gave them the message. And that somebody has enough power to tell them, look into the camera and say these words exactly. And then they say, yes, sir. They obey. So there's some kind of a higher power above all these congressmen. We don't know exactly who it is, but we can make an educated guess. The real dichotomy is the two systems of governance. And then either you support the globalist oligarchy, the moneylender cabal, or you support people who are fighting for your country's sovereignty and independence. And I think that those fault lines are now clear enough to a critical mass of people that I think that Donald Trump will enjoy sufficient support that he will be, let's say, a lot more insulated from this attack than he was during his first 4 years in office. It's the 4 years of Russiagate, the 8 years of almost non-stop persecution of Donald Trump with lawfare. They haven't stopped him, they haven't defeated him. And I think that in the process, the American people have learned some important lessons. And we've seen that even some leading Democratic politicians switched sides over to Donald Trump because the false dichotomy between left and right, people are understanding that's fake. It appears to me that Trump administration is dead serious about what they're doing. And if they're opposed to the oligarchic system of governance that draws its root from the old continent, from Europe, and I think still is headquartered in the city of London, in the strategic, philosophical, spiritual sense, then for Donald Trump and his government, the natural ally is Russia. And okay, I have to say this, I've never seen a public official in any capacity give an interview with a cross on their forehead. But I suspect that there's symbolism in that too. And then we also have to ask ourselves about the role of democracy, because what I see by even very learned, very well-intentioned observers and analysts is that they look at Trump and they say, oh, Trump is turning totalitarian. Is this a dictatorship being implemented, brought to the United States, ambushing the whole democratic process? And I think that there is something to this. I haven't seen these statements directly, but somebody told me that Peter Thiel was talking about this, that what actually the United States needs is a king, literally. So even dictators, kings, autocrats of other kinds, they're always very sensitive to the will of the people. The will of the people ultimately decides how things go. So we shouldn't be afraid of maybe an enlightened dictatorship. And we see that, for example, Vladimir Putin, every time he implements some kind of a very unpopular policy, as he did by not intervening in Ukraine in 2014, extending the age at which people can go into retirement, his approval rating goes way down, and he is not safe in his position by any means. And I'm not speaking in favor of Donald Trump being a dictator. I'm speaking in favor of us reassessing what we think we know about systems of governance, and then questioning how well the liberal democracies we have today have served us so far. And I think it's quite obvious that they haven't. I think that the proxy war against Russia via Ukraine has been inverted into a proxy war against the West, particularly the city of London, via Ukraine. And now the belligerents, quote unquote, it's not just Russia, but Russia and the United States. And here's why I think that. This saga now has been brewing for several weeks, actually, since even before September. And what we see in the press from day to day is this talk about a deal, about the rare earth minerals in Ukraine that the United States wants to appropriate, and about security guarantees. And this is, again, a distortion. So the offer of the rare earth minerals concessions originates at least since September last year, when Volodymyr Zelensky went to New York. He met with Donald Trump at the Trump Towers and offered him the rare earth minerals deal. And the figure of $500 billion comes from Zelensky, not from Trump. Trump didn't invent that figure. The way British officials and British press are trying to represent it is that Donald Trump, because he can, decided to be very greedy and to take advantage of poor Ukraine in its hour of need, and to basically blackmail them by saying, okay, you turn over your resource wealth to us, otherwise, no, we're not going to help you at all. Now, then Trump comes into power, and in the next few days, Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, goes to Kiev with the draft agreement, and Zelensky rejects it. And I thought that was very strange. And then he speaks with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and he said, yeah, we'll sign that agreement, but I have to run it through my legislative process. And then Marco Rubio gave an interview about this, and he spoke about it, and he said, Zelensky said he would accept the agreement, that he needs to run it through his legislative process. And then 2 days later, he goes to the media and says, I rejected the American deal. And so he now embarrassed the American Secretary of State. He insulted Donald Trump in the process. And I thought that's extraordinarily strange, because how could Volodymyr Zelensky, who is desperate to keep the American support, reject the agreement that he himself offered initially, and to do it in such a brazen, abrasive manner? What could possibly explain this? That didn't seem to make any sense at all. And okay, so if you had Kamala Harris in the White House and the whole Barack Obama team of public officials, then this would all stick. This would all go. But I think that Donald Trump, of all people, can see a hustle from a light year away, and they recognize what the British are doing. And so I think that Trump is playing along to see where it goes, but he's also trolling them. For example, on the 17th of February, he says that Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator. If he's a dictator, then his signature on that agreement is null and void. He doesn't represent Ukraine. And the British officialdom and media just went hysterical and went to Zelensky's defense. And then when Zelensky went to Washington, they understood that there wouldn't be the signing of the agreement that the United States wants. Zelensky wanted security guarantees, and he wasn't going to sign anything anyway. And then what does he do? He flies straight back to London, where he gets hugged and is lionized as a hero. Keir Starmer equates him with Winston Churchill. The media is lionizing him as a righteous freedom fighter and on. And then when Boris Johnson was in Kiev and did all that busy work, he also gave a bunch of interviews to the British media. And he gave away the game, because he said the agreement is essential to keep the United States committed to support Ukraine militarily and financially. And so now here the strategy is quite transparent. The British, and maybe the French as well, are inclined to send their troops to Ukraine. If the United States gives them a security guarantee, that means that they will intervene if something happens to them. Let's say if the Russians attack French or British troops, quote unquote peacekeepers, then the United States gets involved to protect them and to maybe retaliate against Russia, against the Donbas. And so now there's this frantic footwork to keep the United States hooked to the deal, to keep baiting them to stay on board because, hey, there's this rare earth deal that you're going to sign eventually. And also to make sure that the United States continues to provide security guarantees for Ukraine. And then also you make sure that the government in Kiev doesn't align with Russia and that doesn't tear up these agreements that the British have. But I think that if I'm right about all this, and if I'm right that the Trump administration is perfectly aware of what the game is, then for sure in the background, they are preparing for Zelensky's ouster and for a new acting government, and then ultimately new elections. And I believe that they are talking to the Russians about it and that they know more or less who the candidates will be. And I think that they already most likely know who the next president will be. And I suspect it's going to be Valery Zaluzhny, who is now currently the Ukraine's ambassador in London.